I'm just doing a guide video on the steering fabric coupling replacement. I'm doing this on the V8, so XE Falcon. So undo the battery terminal from the steering. Make sure the steering is straight. Make sure the steering's straight, and make sure the steering wheel's straight before you do this job. Rock around under here. What you want to do is take the seat out. All I do is take the 2 bolts out on each side, roll the seats upwards, lift the seat up, and then just lay it over the back seat. So just sort of tilt it so it's tilted back over the back seat. You'll need some towels or something under here to support the bolts so the bolts don't bend. So basically that gives you a lot more room to work in here. Don't do it without the seat. It's a pain in the butt to try and get your head under there, depending on how big you are. For the fake of 4 bolts, it's a lot easier. Just pull the seat up and you just lay it over the back seat. Alright, so it's pretty simple. Take that cover off there. It's just 4 of those 1/4 turn screws. You got the 3 harness connectors up under here. So just use a small screwdriver on each side of those harnesses to lift up the small tabs, and then you'll be able to lever the harnesses apart. They're quite stiff. There's a lot of connectors on there. Undo those 3, and then there's bolts back here. There's the bolts back there. So there's about 5 or 6 little bolts that you need to undo, and that loosens off the plate to the steering column. Then there's 2 bolts up, 2 nuts to undo just up under here. That supports the steering column itself. So don't undo all them. Undo them so they're about 90% out. And then you head into the engine bay. So what you want to do is take the brake booster. You need to be able to take the brake booster out. So to give yourself a bit of room, just undo the brake lines. So when you undo them, try to keep the fluids in there to save the hassle of trying to bleed the master cylinder all over again. So just when you undo them, just get some lecky tape and wrap around them. So undo those 2 lecky tape around them to try and keep the fluid in there. If you've got bungs, use bungs. It just saves a lot of work. That way this thing stays full. It's a bit easier to bleed it. Undo the little plug, obviously, vacuum line. So once you've prepared that, you're going to go underneath again and do the brake booster. Best way to get the brake booster out is with a very long extension bar, like 1.5 feet long. So you got the 3 bolts under there, or nuts I think, holding the brake booster in. So just get a long extension bar with a little one of those angle things on it, and then you can get the bolts undone. So you need about 1.5 feet long angle bar and a little bendy thing on the end, and that'll get you up under the bolts up there, and you can undo them. So leave one, undo the top 2 and leave the bottom one loose. So just about half loose, so it's about halfway out. So then you need to get someone to get hold of the brake master cylinder, the booster itself, take the weight of the booster. Then you'll need to detach it from the brake pedal. So to remember, these things are Bakelite. So the things are Bakelite. So what you want to do is the person on the other side, put on a little bit of an angle, sort of tilted towards the, obviously the driver's side, tilted a little bit so you get a bit of weight off that connection to the brake lever. So you want to be able to do that. There's a little circlip thing you got to undo first, and then just very gently lever it off the brake lever. So remember, don't put weight on them, be very careful with those, and then you'll be able to pull the brake booster out. To obviously take the last of that undo that last little bolt. Then you can get the person on the other side to take the brake booster out. So what I mean, when you're in there, just get the person to take the weight of it and give it a little bit of a move this way, and that'll move the Bakelite little item out of the way, and then you can lever it off the gently lever it off the brake pedal. So remember, support these things. Don't ever hang on to it on the other side. Make sure you sort of hold them properly and look after the other side. Don't lean them against it, because that's just Bakelite, that little lever that goes in. So then the brake booster's out of the way. Then you can do your next job, and that's disconnect the two power steering lines. Again, try and block them off so that fluid doesn't go everywhere. And disconnect the transmission, depending on what shifter this is. This is a column shifter. You can see there's a little split pin set up in there. So the column shifter, it's easy, just disconnect that. And then you've got the fabric coupling down there. A little bit hard to see, unfortunately. Yeah, so the fabric coupling's down there. And once the brake booster's out, it's easy accessible, of course. And there's two bolts that you've got to undo for the fabric coupling, and you've got a couple little lever things you've got to sort of like lever out of the way with a screwdriver to access the bolts. So remember, one very important thing it says in the manual is don't put turning strain on the steering gear. It says because it can wreck the steering box itself. So it's got to be supported. It says in the manual exactly what you need, but basically you've got to make sure the steering coupling does not have pressure on it that transfers into the steering box. So once you've undone the two bolts on the steering coupling and the transmission, the steering column can be removed once you remove those last two bolts that were supporting the steering column itself, and you'll be able to pull the steering column back. Now, based on the manual, there's two things. Based on the manual, it says once to remove the bolts that attach to the steering box, and then you can insert a puller through the bulkhead, meaning from inside the car, meaning the firewall, with a puller, and be able to pull the fabric coupling off from inside the car. So that's what the manual says, but also reading, people just take the pitman arm off itself and pull the steering box out. So that's something that I think you might have to have a bit of a look at when you actually get the steering column out. That you need to, once you get the steering column out, you could undo the bolts holding the steering box, and maybe that gives you a little bit of movement to access the fabric coupling to get the puller through there and pull it off. Anyway, that's what the manual says. I guess you'd have to trial and error that one. So just when you're the pitman, when I was talking about the pitman arm connection to the rod there, that you just use your, what is it, bushing splitter or whatever they call them, the fork thing. So just use that in its place, and then hopefully you've got enough room to lift that cross arm there, whatever they call it, up and over the pitman arm. Or when you remove the steering box with those bolts there, that you can lift it up, you can tilt the steering box, and then that can be disconnected without taking all the rest of the steering arms and all that stuff. Probably the easiest way. Bolts there, and then that should give you the movement on the pitman arm to lift it out. So that might be the easiest way. So yeah, mark the pitman arm. So put a piece of chalk on the pitman arm there and the steering connection to make sure that's so when you reconnect it, it's a lot easier to align. and your alignment can stay. Okay. So once that's done, you can take the rest of the steering box off and use the puller to pull the fabric coupling off, which would be good. So remember, again, you got to make sure you use that tool or use a bolt setup to make sure you don't put pressure on the steering gear while you're doing that job. Okay. And then to put it all back together, make sure it's all straight, you get that angle right again, and put everything back together, bleed the brake lines, you'll have to bleed the power steering lines and all that. So yeah, bit of work. It's probably a bit of work for someone, but a hoist would make it a lot easier. Okay.